Thank you. I am truly honored to be part of this important annual event and want to add my thanks to Marty Belsky, Laura Rolfe, the Planning Committee, and the most meaningful support from Mayor Horrigan and the City of Akron, along with Summit County and their executive, Eileen Shapiro. You know, many communities have Holocaust Remembrance Days or programs, but not with the full partnership of their city and county. This speaks volumes about our special community. Last month, we commemorated the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where 700 young Jewish fighters decided to actively fight back against the Nazis. During the uprising, the civilian population in the ghetto also resisted German forces by refusing to assemble at collection points and burrowing in underground bunkers. At least 7,000 Jews died fighting or in hiding in the ghetto. It's a remarkable story of bravery, and it's also a story in danger of not being told. I mention this because 80 years is a long time, and we are quickly losing the last generation of survivors who can provide firsthand testimony about what they and others experienced. My father was one of them. Last May, Michael Blain passed away at age 94. He was an incredible man, truly inspirational, who made it through the worst calamity ever for the Jewish people with his faith and his belief in humanity intact. His story is both incredible and tragic. Incredible in terms of the smart and fortunate decisions that allowed him to survive, but tragic in terms of the family he lost, including his parents, my grandparents, siblings, nieces, and cousins. I remember daily my learnings from his life and hope to impart just a small sampling of them tonight. My father was born in 1928 and raised in the tiny Czechoslovakian town of Silc. During the war, Silc became part of Hungary. Today it's part of Ukraine. My father was one of 7 children. While his family was far from wealthy, his father had a respectable job. They always had food and clothing and shelter, and they were known for their acts of kindness. For this reason, visitors to the town in need of a hot meal or a place to stay were always sent to his house because people knew they would be taken care of by the family. In Europe at that time, at least in the villages, school ended at the age of 14. After that, you were expected to find work to help your families. Most boys would leave for a larger city, and the closest city to Silc was Budapest. So that's where my dad went, by himself, at age 14 in 1942. Just to be clear, at age 14, he moved away from his family to a major city in another country, 140 kilometers from home, to learn a trade. At age 14, I was often afraid to stay home by myself. While he had to wear the yellow star, moving to Budapest actually saved his life. The Jews in Budapest weren't as affected by the occupation as those in the countryside. But back in Silc, while he was in Budapest, the Nazis rounded up the remaining Jews and shipped them to Auschwitz, including his entire family. Meanwhile, my father made a series of smart and fortunate decisions. At the age of 14, while he was still in Budapest, he and others were discovered by soldiers in Hungarian uniforms. They thought this was the end. Turns out they were Jews who had somehow acquired the military uniforms and helped them cross borders and seek shelter to get out of harm's way. Of the 13 members of my father's immediate family, he was one of only 3 to survive. On January 15th, 1945, he was liberated by Russian troops. He went back to his birth village, which during the war became part of the Soviet Union, only to be greeted by anti-Semitic neighbors. His parents' home had been looted. As he walked through the village, he noticed some family items in the homes of neighbors, people he had known his entire life. When he asked if he could have a few of the items back, he was told, "I'd rather burn them than give it back to a Jew." Later, with the help of the Red Cross, he was able to locate his 2 surviving siblings, his older brother Sam and older sister Miriam. Sam, who survived Auschwitz, arrived back in Silc, while Miriam, who had been in Western Europe during the war, made it to New York. My father quickly and thankfully came to the realization that the Soviet Union was not a good place to be, particularly for Jews, and hired a smuggler to get him back over the border to the west. There were 2 carriages of people smuggled that evening in the middle of a snowstorm. My father decided to go with the second group, which was a good decision since the first group was captured by the Soviets and sent to Siberia. My father got out, but my uncle and his family were among the over 1 million Soviet Jews who faced harsh discrimination behind the Iron Curtain. After my father safely crossed the border, he was part of a group of 100 orphan children who were taken to England, where he started to rebuild his life. In 1949, he moved to New York to be with his sister. Not too long after, he and other survivors were drafted by the US Army to fight in Korea. In 1953, after returning from the Korean War, he became a US citizen. He benefited from the GI Bill, which allowed him to go to the Rochester Institute of Technology, where he majored in printing, founded the Campus Hillel chapter, and most important, met his future wife, my mother, Sylvia. My father's career took him from Rochester to Cleveland to Indianapolis and then back to Cleveland for the final years of his life. Professionally, he spent over 30 years as the Indiana director for State of Israel bonds, where he was responsible for selling well over $100 million in bonds. But that's not the only thing he accomplished. He and my mother had 3 sons. Between the 3 of us, myself and my brothers, we have 12 children. And those 12 children have 25 children of their own, with at least 1 more on the way. This was truly my father's proudest accomplishment, reinforced every time he was called Saba, which is Hebrew for grandpa, by a grandchild or great-grandchild. Rather than Hitler killing him and all the generations which followed, my father got the final say. So that's the story. That's my family's history. It's in my DNA. It's unique in some ways, but like tens of thousands of others who somehow managed to survive this devastating time, there was no normal. Anyone who survived was fortunate beyond words. The odds were very much against it, and this story could have easily gone the other way. I could never fully understand my father's experiences, how he survived, and the depth of his grief. A few years ago, I traveled to Poland, which of course included a visit to Auschwitz, where many of my family members, including my grandmother, died in the gas chambers. But even with these close personal connections to the Holocaust, it also felt very distant in time and place and impossible to align with my generation and my own experience growing up in the United States, let alone the experience of my children. It didn't feel real. Now, sadly, it does. The Holocaust illustrates the consequences of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping on a society. That's why we must never forget. There's a lot written about the causes and process of genocide, which is linked to wars or economic crisis, autocratic or charismatic leaders, the dehumanization, scapegoating, and stereotyping of victims, tribalism and nationalism, groupthink, and the power of the mob. And now, in 2023, we can add to the list the power of social media to tell lies and mobilize people. Since the Holocaust, we've witnessed too many genocides and wars with millions of civilian casualties. Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine. Turn back the clock further, and you can include Native Americans and African Americans on that list. And it's happening to people not so different from you and I. In Ukraine, just 1 year ago, people were living peaceful lives, enjoying their families, their homes, their hobbies, their careers, going to school. Overnight, those lives were changed dramatically. What is also clear is that this is a perilous time for the Jewish people. Recently, the ADL issued a report showing that anti-Semitic incidents in the United States reached an all-time high in 2021, with a total of 2,717 incidents of assault, harassment, and vandalism. This represents the highest number of incidents on record since the ADL started tracking these incidents in 1979, and a 34% increase over 2020. Attacks against Jewish institutions, including JCCs and synagogues, were up by 61%. Incidents at K-12 schools increased over 100%, and incidents on college campuses rose 21%. And all of these numbers were even higher in 2022. Never Forget isn't only about honoring the memory of those who perished. It's also about remembering and preventing the dangers of unchecked prejudice and hatred, regardless of who's on the receiving end. That's why we must never forget. My father understood at his core the dangers these trends pose for all of us. And for that reason, he believed strongly that our responsibility has to go well beyond remembering the Holocaust to understanding how it happened and the lessons we should have learned from it. He was always willing to talk about his experience when asked, particularly to non-Jewish groups. He was moved by the letters he invariably received from the students who heard his story, many of whom had no prior knowledge of the Holocaust. Most important, my father understood that hatred anywhere could easily become hatred everywhere. For that reason, he had a strong place in his heart for groups facing their own existential challenges: Soviet Jews, African Americans, refugees, the hungry, the homeless. He became an activist for the people of Darfur as they faced the threat of their own genocide, attending the national rally in Washington, speaking at one in Indianapolis, and writing about it in the local paper. Like my father, it's evident we are losing a generation remarkable for not only having survived the Holocaust, but for how they were able to move forward, rebuild their lives, create families and businesses, and help shape and lead communities. As we lose this generation, it becomes even more important to tell their stories and honor their memories, like we're doing today. So what can we, together, do about this? First, be vigilant and vocal. Call out anti-Semitism and other isms as they happen, regardless of the source, and come to the defense of those being victimized. It is much easier to default to silence, but as Martin Luther King said, the ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people. And at the same time, we need to be careful how we do this, especially when the cause may be ignorance. Second, while forums like this are very constructive, it's also critical that we help children at an early age understand the dangers of hate. It's much more difficult to change an adult's perspective than to get it right the first time. Children are not born with hate in their hearts. They learn that from others. A critical component of education is helping people understand that this isn't only about skin color or appearance, but extends to religion, nationalities, gender, sexual orientation. Our differences should be celebrated, not vilified. And finally, build coalitions. In the United States, minorities have become the majority, which means there's a great deal of potential in bringing groups together around common interest. Positive examples of this in Akron include the JEDI program, sponsored by Love Akron, and the longstanding Muslim-Jewish dialogue co-convened by Temple Israel and the Islamic Society. There is no substitute for breaking bread between people. Yet, perhaps the strongest coalition is the one between people who care, people who seek justice, people who love their neighbor and the stranger, and those who don't. While it is easy to lose hope, throw up our arms, and walk away, I'm reminded by a passage from the Jewish text of Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers. You are not required to finish your work, yet neither are you permitted to desist from it. Thank you so much for including me in this forum. Just the fact that this series takes place every year is incredibly meaningful and reassuring. There's great comfort knowing that we have friends who recognize and speak out against anti-Semitism and who are committed to making never again a reality, not just a slogan. Thank you for everything you're doing to promote a more peaceful and kinder tomorrow. Have a good evening.